Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined again by Keith Preston, Swithun, Dobson, and Terminal Philosophy. The last time we had a roundtable discussion, it was about what is socialism. And we got some people commenting saying, well, you didn't bring up fascism much. And it was kind of like, well, yeah, we kind of ran out of time. So we'll sort of continue, it's sort of a continuation of what is socialism. Is fascism socialist? So briefly, as I understand it, the left will argue that fascism is late stage capitalism, reactionary, and not really revolutionary at all. But with the rise of the alt right, we've also mentioned their more Nazbol strand today, people like Keith Woods have been emphasizing how Mussolini and Hitler self identified as fascists and said that, well, what they were doing was they were taking, or socialists, they were taking socialism and applying it practically. I mean, sort of like how Lenin applied it, socialism pragmatically with the vanguard. It didn't have, Marx didn't predict it, Bernstein didn't predict it, but Lenin just sort of grabbed the bull by the horns and made it happen. And they're sort of arguing, well, we're being pragmatic like that. That's sort of this new narrative we're getting from elements of the alt-right, really going back 10 years. So Keith, why don't you sort of explain the origin of fascism, what is fascism, and whether you think it's socialist or not?
Well, there's a lot to unpack with that. I'll try not to be too verbose. As for the question of whether or not fascism is socialism, my direct answer to that would be no. But it's a kind of a complicated no, because if we look at the history of fascism, I mean, the term fascism was coined by Mussolini. It's named after the fascis, which is an ancient Roman symbol. Mussolini thought of himself as sort of a modern Caesar, or he was trying to revive the Italian Roman Empire. So that's where the term comes from. Mussolini himself had been a leader in the Italian Socialist Party, and many people thought of him as being the natural head of a future socialist government in Italy. In fact, I think even Lenin had that view of Mussolini at one point. However, Mussolini was like a lot of other intellectuals or semi-intellectuals who, after World War II, decided that the Marxist rendition of socialism had become untenable, in large part because the World Workers' Revolution had not panned out. In fact, during 1919, that was a crisis, or during the time of the World War I generally, was a crisis period for the left, because the Marxist view that there was going to be this worldwide workers' revolution didn't take place. Instead, the working classes all rallied behind their respective national states during World War I. So that was sort of a problem for Marxists, and there were Marxists who went in lots of different directions after that. But one point of view that Mussolini adopted was to sort of redefine the idea of class struggle, or where you would remove the idea of the proletariat as an independent, autonomous actor, and instead redefine the Marxist class struggle in terms of nations. And Italian fascism, at least in theory, was based on the idea that Italy was a proletarian nation that was waging national class struggle against the dominant hegemonic Western Atlantic powers, mostly England and essentially the Allies in World War I, the winning team in World War I. So on a more theoretical level, that's what Italian fascism was. Now, a lot of people, when they think of fascism, they think of the Nazis, National Socialism. Nazism is something that's far more extreme than conventional fascism. You could say that Nazism is to fascism what something like Pol Pot is, or maybe Maoism is to Marxism, Leninism. It's like the extreme of the extreme of the extreme. And a National Socialism was certainly borrowed from Italian fascism. I mean, they had the brown shirts and the open palm Roman salute and all of that kind of stuff. But they also borrowed from the racial mysticism that was created in the 19th century by figures like Houston Stewart Chamberlain. And also they borrowed from Bolshevism quite a bit, the whole idea of the cult of the party, and then the personality cult that was built up around Stalin and then later Hitler. So Nazism is something that's more extreme than conventional fascism. That's a point that's often lost. But as far as the basic question of whether any of these things constitute socialism, I would say no, because traditional socialism, going back to the early 19th century, as we talked about last week, was either just a generic term for social reform in its broader meaning. It had nothing to do with any kind of revolutionary extremism per se. You could be a self-proclaimed socialist and be an aristocrat or a capitalist, under that definition of socialism. Among more ideological socialists, you had a movement that was strictly oriented towards materialism. It's all about this idea of advancing the material interest of the working class or the poor or somebody like that. Now, the socialists may have had a lot of different ideas in terms of what they thought socialism would be. You have the anarcho-syndicalist view that wants to do away with the state altogether and have sort of a federation of workers' councils. And then you have the Marxist, or I guess the Leninist view of socialism, the idea of a collectivized command economy. But all of these things, even though they're vastly different from each other in terms of form, they're all rooted in this kind of materialistic philosophy that's about economism. That's something that socialism shares with classical liberalism, in the sense that you have this, or at least with classical liberal economics, it's very oriented towards this kind of economistic outlook, that material values and economic development and prosperity and things like that are paramount. They may have different ideas on how to achieve that, but that's something that capitalism and communism and conventional socialism have in common. Now, it's also true that fascism and, by extension, National Socialism are anti-capitalist. I would say both of those are very anti-capitalist and anti-bourgeois in a way that conventional conservatives, or certainly what Americans think of as conservatives, certainly aren't. But they are anti-capitalist and anti-bourgeois for much different reason than conventional socialists. The fascist and National Socialist view of bourgeois society and capitalism is that capitalism is decadent, it's degenerative, it's a deterioration of civilization, that it elevates commercial and consumer and material values to the status of the highest values when they shouldn't be, which is the polar opposite view of both communism and capitalism, both of which say that material values are essentially paramount. Fascism and National Socialism have the polar opposite view. They detest what they consider to be the vulgar economism of conventional socialists as well as capitalists. They find commercial culture to be aesthetically unappeasing, if not abominable. They have an idea that's very similar to what you find in some more throne and altar conservative thinking, or maybe some ancient philosophy that has a very strong disdain for the world of merchants, and the idea that in a bourgeois republic, like a modern liberal republic, the idea of making the merchant class, what in older times they would have called the merchant class, the idea of making that into the ruling class and putting it in control of the state is considered absurd. So fascism has this kind of traditionalist anti-capitalism and disdain for bourgeois society as well, in a way that's similar to the throne and altar critique of modernity. At the same time, fascism differs from that kind of conservatism also, because it also views traditional aristocracy as decadent, and it has a much more modernist outlook. It tends to look at it like, well, no, what the real aristocrats are the men of action. That is they would appropriate Nietzsche and thinkers like that. I mean, they were reading Nietzsche wrong, but they would take this kind of vulgarized version of Nietzsche, and they would say that, well, what really matters is the Uberman, the man of action, the man who rises above, the masses and that kind of thing. And whereas, the idea of an aristocrat who is someone who simply inherits their position and spends their life collecting fine wine or something, that's not the fascist ideal of what a superior person ought to be. So fascism is this kind of revolutionary right that is an opposition to both the traditional throne and altar right, as well as the modern bourgeois kind of conservative right. Fascism stands in opposition to both of those, as well as to the left. Unfortunately, I think a lot of critics of fascism get this wrong, because the left, as Todd said, tends to look at it like, well, fascism is just the strong arm of capitalism, because they'll say, well, fascism are basically mercenaries for capitalism. When capitalism is threatened by socialism or communism, what does capitalism do? It basically aligns itself with fascism to destroy socialism. That's in a nutshell, that's the Marxist view of fascism, which is greatly oversimplified. And then a lot of libertarians view fascism as socialism, simply because they think any government involvement in the economy is socialism, or simply because, well, they'll say, well, Hitler's party had the name National Socialist. Now, the National Socialists did have an actual socialist contingent in their party, and they were all massacred when Hitler took state power, and they were purged in the Night of the Long Knives. So that was not the central thrust of National Socialism. What fascism and National Socialism are types of, they're a revolutionary right that is anti-conservative, anti-bourgeois, as well as anti-leftist and liberal. They conceive of the nation or the state or the race or some combination of those as being paramount. For Nazis, it's the race. For conventional fascism, it's usually the nation, the state, maybe the church in clerical fascism. And then they conceive of the nation that they're a part of as engaged in some sort of revolutionary struggle against some external dominant power. It's fairly similar to the anti-colonial Marxist movements that developed in the 20th century in that regard, but it also has a different philosophical framework. It's not about egalitarianism, either between classes or between nations. It's about this idea of the national rejuvenation, and the nation is going to become great, and it's going to conquer, and it's going to establish, whatever it's going to establish. In some ways, I think fascism is probably more comparable to some of the revolutionary movements we saw in the 20th century in the Middle East, like Nasser, like Pan-Arabism and Baathism, and even Khomeinism and stuff like that. In the sense that all these kinds of movements, movements that could broadly be considered a revolutionary right, tend to happen in countries that have a fairly they're not peasant third world societies, but they're in their early stages of developing a modern economy and cultural framework and stuff like that. And they usually view themselves as being under the domination of some external power that they have some kind of resentment against. For example, Iran during the Ayatollah Khomeini's revolution, the idea, well, okay, we're going to have this national Shia-based revolution, and we're going to expel the Americans and the Europeans and all of that. They didn't specifically identify as fascist, because conventional fascism is usually secular, although there is a Catholic variation of clerical fascism. But in all of these kinds of revolutionary right-wing movements, that's the kind of framework in which it kind of usually takes place, the kind of geopolitical and technological and economic framework in which these kinds of movements typically emerge. And fascism and National Socialism are both within that kind of tradition.
All right. And what are your thoughts? We can't seem to hear Swithun. Let's try this again. Okay, Swithun?
Can you hear me, Todd? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Can you hear? Great, okay. So to the direct question whether fascism is socialist. Whilst, as we discussed last time, historically there's various different concepts of what socialism actually constituted. I mean, if you take the strict view that socialism is the public ownership of the means of production, well, then fascism isn't really socialism. If you take Mussolini as the archetypal fascist, what you really have is a corporatist economy. And Mussolini saw it as a third way between socialism and capitalism. And it was a way of coordinating the interests of the business class the government and also the workers, and they were all sort of worked together in harmony. Interestingly, Mussolini on this basis was very popular amongst American intellectuals in the 30s. I think John Dewey was a big fan of him, because basically Mussolini's project was very similar to FDR's in economic sense. It was public works programs. It was coordination of production, and it was a way of trying to get what were perceived as three broadly antagonistic groups to work together: the state, the business class, and the workers. So it isn't really socialism. Now, the libertarians will say, oh, yes, it is, because they'll say FDR is a socialist, which is, if you're going to take, as Keith mentioned, if you're going to take a view of sort of anarcho-capitalism on one side and socialism on the other, well, yeah, it's not anarcho-capitalism, and it's kind of FDR is moving them more towards socialism. But the question arises whether a single sliding economic scale is actually an interesting way of doing things. Also, what is of interest is Robert Hicks. So one reason why it isn't socialism, I don't think. One argument for Robert Hicks, who's an economic historian, as to why the Great Depression lasted so long in America, was that he uses evidence from questionnaires given out to business owners, etc. And basically, the survey results essentially say they're concerned that FDR will essentially turn the US into a socialist state, which implies that FDR never actually did it. They were just concerned that they would, and consequently, they didn't invest, and so the investment levels plummeted, and therefore you didn't get the recovery which you might otherwise expect. So that's another reason, as I say, as to why fascism, at least in the branch of Mussolini and sort of classic fascism in that sense, isn't socialistic. Then the question arises, is National Socialism socialist? Because whilst they describe themselves both as fascist, I mean, the regimes of Mussolini and the National Socialists in Germany are significantly different. There's far, far, far more state control and power in the National Socialist government than there was in Mussolini. Mussolini, to a large extent, was a bit of an classic authoritarian, beat a few people up, but mostly didn't have as much power as you might think he did. So whilst in National Socialist Germany, my understanding is you had nominal private ownership of the means of production, you got to such a level of state, you have a very, very, very heavy level of state regulation, which to a large extent you could claim, whilst the property titles were nominally private, they were essentially decisions of a state planning board. Now, whether that actually did happen or not, I would need to know more about the exact system in National Socialist Germany. But there is a way, even though it might not formally be socialistic, it could in practice end up being socialistic. But that isn't true of fascism as such, at least in the Mussolini variety. And as I repeat, National Socialism is significantly different from fascism. So that would be my sort of take on the economics of the situation.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that's been said so far. I think one thing that will help kind of orient fascism for this conversation is that fascism is not socialism, but only just barely, in the sense that it does share the same intellectual and theoretical genealogy as 20th and 19th century socialism for the most part. But yes, it is, among other things, its own unique sort of political entity from the socialists and the capitalists. As Keith mentioned before, the Italian fascists saw themselves in the framework of proletariat nations versus the more oppressive and powerful and decadent capitalist powers like the United States, Great Britain, and France. And it should also be mentioned too that fascism was more of a nationalist phenomenon than it was internationalist. So that, I think, is one important differentiation from classical 19th century socialism versus 20th century fascism, because the socialists wanted to implement a worldwide worker proletariat revolution, whereas a lot of fascist dictators would famously say, and I think Hitler said, well, National Socialism isn't for export, and I think Mussolini said something very similar. And it should be mentioned that leaders like Franco in Spain, he wasn't exactly a fascist. He often gets confused as a fascist, but he was much more of a Catholic monarchist, and he had an interesting relationship with Hitler and Mussolini. He accepted military help and military aid in the Spanish Revolution, but he had his own personal qualms. I think, for example, I've tried to look up some information on this, but I don't know if he had some Jewish members in his family, so I think that made things difficult for him. In addition, so I would answer no, fascism is not socialism, but only just barely. And along with this, I would argue that I think fascism is something that just simply is not alive today. It's something again, the best information that I've had access to on fascism is Stanley Payne and Paul Gottfried, and I think they more or less argue that fascism is something that is isolated in the past, whereas you could say today that you could ask the question, well, is socialism something that's living and evolving today? And I would say that's a definite yes, whereas fascism it's more of an internet phenomenon at this point than anything else.
Yeah. One aspect I think that helps distinguish fascism and National Socialism from socialism is Karl Lowenstein's distinction between authoritarian and totalitarian states. He writes, the term authoritarian denotes a political organization in which the single power holder, an individual person or dictator, an assembly, a committee, a junta, or a party, monopolizes political power. However, the term authoritarian refers to the structure of government rather than to the structure of society. As a rule, the authoritarian regime confines itself to political control of the state without aspiring to complete domination of the socioeconomic life of the community. By contrast, the term totalitarian refers to socioeconomic dynamism, the way of life of a state society. The governmental techniques of a totalitarian regime are necessarily authoritarian, but the regime does much more than exclude the power addresses from the legitimate share in the formation of the will of the state. It attempts to mold the private life, the soul, the spirit, and the mores of the citizens to a dominant ideology. The officially proclaimed ideology penetrates into every nook and cranny of society. Its ambition is total. And I think you mentioned, Swithun, that nominally private property still exists under National Socialism. And, you pointed out, Keith, that, socialism has this more, holistic, radical perspective to it. And I think that really is one of the key dividing differences, is that socialism begins with the attack on the institution of the family, the state, and markets, and then recently you could argue with transgenderism and everything else, with an attack on the identity of sex itself. But it seeks to sort of abolish all of the things that we take for granted, which fascism doesn't really do that, and National Socialism doesn't really do that. And in fact, from the point of view of Hitler and Mussolini, they were preserving what they thought were, authentic Italian and German values, whereas they weren't trying to necessarily create something out of whole cloth. And I think this authoritarian totalitarian distinction is important in differentiating the two. What are some of your thoughts on that, Keith?
I would agree with probably all of that, except for maybe one point about the actual character of the state in Nazi Germany. But a lot of people today, particularly in the Western, traditionally liberal countries, associate fascism with virtually any kind of right-wing authoritarianism. Now, to use fascism in that broad a context, you would have to say that virtually all societies that ever existed up until a century or so ago were fascist. because they think, well, everything, if a conventional military dictatorship by that standard is fascist, a traditional monarchy by that standard would be fascist, America in the pre-civil rights era would be fascist. I mean, that's so everything that ever existed was fascist according to that standard, and I guess that's what some of the Antifa types actually believe. Yeah, Franco, as terminal philosophy said, was not a fascist. He was just a traditional Catholic monarchist. His system was basically a restoration of feudalism with some modern characteristics. The same is true with Salazar in Portugal. That was a similar system. And then also all the military dictatorships you found in Latin America throughout the 20th century, most of those were just traditional right-wing authoritarian regimes, strongman regimes. Really, none of those were quote-unquote fascist. The one that came the closest was probably the Perón regime, but even that was sort of more populist than fascist per se. The Mussolini regime, from what I have read about it, it seems to have been fairly similar to a traditional right-wing authoritarian regime. They didn't go out of their way to attack the church or the monarchy or private property or any of that. They kind of left all that intact. They probably would have preferred not to, but they did. They had to make those concessions. Probably a big difference, though, between Italian fascism and some of the other traditional authoritarian regimes was that the ideology did play a greater role. For instance, in the educational system in fascist Italy, they did introduce curriculum where they had this special glorification of the Italian nation and that kind of thing. In the same way that, say, education in a parochial school might be very specifically oriented towards Catholicism and the catechism and the church traditions and all that. The Italian fascists did that with this kind of deification of the Italian nation. So I do think they were somewhat more ideological in that sense than maybe a traditional right-wing authoritarian regime would be. Whereas, like, for example, in those regimes, they don't really care about education as long as you're not teaching something that's going to subvert the state. As long as you're not teaching students to become Marxist and overthrow the government or something, they'll have something to say about that. But generally, though, they just have a more traditional approach to education. But German National Socialism, though, was much closer to communism than either Italian fascism or right-wing authoritarianism. It is true that the state was much more pervasive in terms of its role in the economy. About 50% of the German economy was nationalized, and the other half was heavily regulated. Now, a lot of that had to do with the war. I mean, the American economy during the World War II wasn't that far removed from that either. So the context does matter. But I think even more important than the economy is the National Socialism. German National Socialism was like communism in the sense that it tried to steer every aspect of life toward the service of the state in a way that you don't typically see in a right-wing authoritarian regime. Like in a right-wing authoritarian regime, the family has some degree of autonomy. The church generally has some degree of autonomy. There's a great deal of autonomy for business and just civil society generally, except for the far left parties or something like that. But in German National Socialism, there was much more much stronger effort to control the church. They created a fake state church that they call positive Christianity, which is basically this. It's kind of like Christian identity or something. It's this weird, Aryanized Christianity, like Jesus was an Aryan and things like that. Which is similar to what the Soviets did. The Soviets would have these fake Russian Orthodox churches that had party functionaries as priests, where they basically taught communism. That was one thing. Also, as far as the family, in German National Socialism, there was mandatory membership in the Hitler Youth for German youth. And they had to go off to these indoctrination camps for the Hitler Youth, irrespective of whether the parents approved of this or not. Just like in the communist system, they had to belong to what they typically called the Young Pioneers, which was something very similar. Also, most of the traditional right-wing authoritarian regimes did not practice open genocide against entire populations the way German National Socialism did. Not even Mussolini's Italy didn't do this, but the German National Socialism did specifically identify entire populations for extermination. The Jews is the well-known one, also the Roma and the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the entire spectrum of leftists, communists and socialists and feminists, homosexuals, also Slavs and other some other ethnic groups as well. So they did have a specific genocide. The disabled, the mentally handicapped, that was another one. The eugenics program of of National Socialism was also very extreme. It was very, they actually took the idea from the Americans, but then they took what the Americans did and went crazy with it. And so that was much more pervasive than what you find in a more traditional right-wing authoritarian regime as well. So I would argue that the German National Socialism was much closer to something like Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, Kim Il-sung, those kinds of the communist dictators of the 20th century. Some of the economics is different in the sense that, no, you didn't have a completely 100% nationalized, collectivized, centrally planned economy, but you did have this massive war economy that approached that, in as much as you could and still have conventional capitalism at the same time. One thing, though, that's interesting to look at is how the American elite and Western elites generally viewed Hitler and Mussolini when they first came to power. They were not that worried about them at all initially. A lot of American elites at the time viewed Mussolini favorably, and that was on the right and on the left. You had people on the left who thought of Mussolini as a proto-socialist or something like that, and then you also had people from the right who liked them, who thought that they were modernizing Italy. They thought Italian fascism was modernizing Italy and bringing it out of being this kind of backward, feudal, third worldish type of country. You had business interests that liked the fact that they did suppress militant strikes and things like that. One issue too that's important is it was pointed out earlier by Terminal Philosophy that the fascism differs from Marxism in terms of it doesn't have this internationalist creed. It's nationalist, not internationalist. That's also important in another context, because the reason that fascists tend to have a negative view of the unions and will often engage in strike breaking and union busting activity is that they see that as disruptive to national cohesion. The idea in fascism is that everything is subordinated to the interest of the nation, and the state is the manifestation of the nation. So you don't have class struggle in a unified, coherent nation. No, all classes are subordinated to the nation or to the state. And that includes a capitalist class too. So fascism is anti-liberal or anti-capitalist or anti-bourgeois in that sense. They say no, the business class, the banks, the industrialists, they're subordinated to this nation as well, as are the unions and the political parties and all of that. So that's an important difference there between fascism and socialism. So yeah, I mean and also I think Terminal Philosophy is absolutely correct in the sense that the two best scholars that I know of who've written about the history of fascism are Paul Gottfried and Stan Payne, both of whom I know personally. And I think that they really nail down pretty well what fascism was. And that is, it was this kind of revolutionary right that emerged in the interwar period. I would add to that fascist-like movements that are either fascism or something that's similar to it, almost always emerges in a similar geopolitical and economic context. It's always in countries that are in an early stage of industrial development and are under the perceived or real or perceived domination of some larger, more advanced power. And yeah, that's where a lot of Western European or Southern Central European countries were in the 20th century. It's where some early 20th century. It's where some Middle Eastern countries were in the latter 20th century. But that's not relevant to Western politics today at all. I mean, the fascism exists in the advanced industrial democracies only in the imagination of the Antifa.
Exactly. Swithun, what are some of your thoughts on that?
I would pretty much agree with Keith's assessment here. The level of as the distinction you made, Todd, with the authoritarian and the totalitarian regimes, fascism in sort of Mussolini's era really doesn't have the level of ideological control that you see in Stalinism or in National Socialist Germany. And the amount of power that it kind of, what it may have wanted to do more, he had to make the concessions, as Keith pointed out. So whether or not, if Mussolini would have remained longer, hadn't lost the war, would he have been able to extend his ideological control to a greater degree? Maybe, possibly. But whether it would have been to the same extent as National Socialist Germany or Stalinist Russia, I think unlikely. So the general accusation of any sort of restrictions, say, on freedom of speech, which the left would point to, or artistic expression, is fascist. It's like, well, yeah, you could say that to some extent with ideological control. It's not on the front line of ideological control in the way that, say, the socialists were, and of course the modern progressive, who in ideological terms is of course very similar to the socialist. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, fascism just isn't really socialism, and as TP pointed out, fascism, apart from on the internet.
Yeah. So, terminal philosophy, your thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that's been said so far. I think one thing that's important to mention is that I think it's important to make a distinction between, in the early 20th century, what was known as traditional conservative interwar movements and the revolutionary right of Europe. I think, with maybe a few historical exceptions, that Italian fascism can claim, and to a broader extent, National Socialism can probably claim the category of revolutionary right. Again, a revolutionary right wasn't out to defend the old institutions of church and old societal institutions. It's important to think of fascism as a modernist movement. It's a 20th century invention, and it saw itself as reacting to a lot of different things, and that included the big juggernaut of the East, which would eventually become Joseph Stalin, as well as the decadent and overly just the decadent capitalist powers of the West. And that's why Mussolini saw it as a third path away from these two things. So yeah, fascism really was its own sort of unique entity amongst these two other big players. Fascism saw itself as reacting to a situation that developed after bourgeois society had established itself. And it also saw itself reacting to the political situation in Europe after a radical left had established itself as well. So you could say that fascism's existence was partially dependent on the pre-establishment of a radical left. It's socialistic in nature because it shares sort of the same genealogical origins, but it takes off in a very different direction, in the sense that again, they incorporated a lot of things like Nietzsche, and Evola Julius Evola played a big part in Italian fascism, in the sense that this was very emphasis on the strongman politics. And Evola, I think, even amongst the other Italian fascists at the time, was considered very much a radical, because he wanted to return to something like an Imperium Romanum, where like a warrior caste aristocracy system. So whether or not that would have been possible in the 1930s and 40s is a different question, but he wanted to go so far back that it was, I think his anti-modernist views clashed a lot with the modernisms of fascism at the time. And yeah, let me just share one quote from Paul Gottfried that I think will help put this in perspective. Sorry, I just found it. This says, Stanley Payne may come the closest to grasping the rightism of fascism when he painstakingly differentiates it from the interwar European rightist movements. Fascists were different from the new conservative authoritarian right, which was generally more moderate and more conservative on every issue than the fascists. So there's, and that goes on and on, but I won't do that for just this stream. But fascism is not quite socialism in the sense that it also has this emphasis on local, you could even say national or regionalistic cultures. And that's something that fascism kind of either wanted to defend certain parts of or at least redefine. Fascism has always had an interesting Latin character to it as well. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, the idea that fascism has a sort of parochial or even racial focus versus an internationalist focus. That fascism tends to be more interested in keeping things sort of as they are without letting them get, either more capitalistic or more socialistic, more Marxist. I tend to see that as another distinguishing factor as well. But what we really get at is fascism itself as an ideology really only exists as a foil or resistance movement to socialism. Now, this got Mises in trouble later on in life, but in his 1927 work, Liberalism, he praises fascism as Europe's vanguard against the Bolshevik terror. He's speaking about Mussolini at this point. This is before World War II. And we see that it's really difficult to even envision how fascism might have been developed without socialism. I mean, one, there wouldn't be the need, but then two, the very shape that it took is such that it's really only clearly a reaction to socialism. I mean, once the socialist threat is removed, think of like Franco in Spain, Salazar in Portugal, however you want to classify the Guomindang in Taiwan, they transition to a more parliamentary democratic system. Whereas the half-life of a socialist system is pretty long. The Soviet regime kept on passing the ideology down to a new premier again and again and again, such that it didn't collapse after one ruler. Like fascism tends to collapse after a single ruler, and in part because it is only there to fight the socialists. And once the socialists are beaten, well, then it's like, we're done, time to go home now. So what are some of your thoughts on that, Swithun?
Yeah, I would agree, broadly speaking, that, yeah, I mean, without socialism, you're not going to get fascism, insofar as it is self-consciously a reaction, in a sense, a reactionary or a reactionary futurist ideology against the socialists. Now, that said, could you have a more generic sort of corporatist authoritarianism which would last longer than sort of the specific sort of fascism of Mussolini? I think that's entirely possible. So, for example, you could argue that on sort of an authoritarian corporatist model, you could claim the current Chinese economy is actually similar to that in certain respects. Now, of course, there's massive more social control. Obviously, there's the social credit system, etc., etc. So you have the much tighter ideological aspect. But whether you could have a corporatist, sort of an authoritarian corporatist model, which could exist instead, that wasn't, say, a reaction to socialism. I think that's certainly possible, and actually is probably where the West is going, at least at present, especially with the stronger hand of the states being shown around with their ridiculous lockdown policies, etc., and a general disdain for sort of civil liberties, etc. Which reminds me, interestingly, of a point Jordan Peterson makes, that the relationship between sort of authoritarian personality and disease, prevalence of disease, is very high. When you have societies with high levels of infectious diseases, etc., everybody is concerned about purity, which leads to sort of authoritarian personality, but not in the Adornian sense necessarily. So yeah, as the specifics of fascism, no, but as the sort of the economics and general structure, I think it could have a longer half-life. Although, as I said, the societies we kind of could get in the near future, which you could say are sort of authoritarian corporatist, also have the kind of ideological control to some extent. In that you could make the claim that democracy lends itself to kind of the ideological control of sort of socialism, insofar as every part of life becomes politicized because everybody can vote and everything. And so there's always the incentive to make everything a political issue. And of course, if that's the case, all political ideology is of great importance, and thus control of education, etc., is of course paramount. So there is that difference, but yes, I do think authoritarian corporatism can make a comeback if it doesn't already exist.
All right, Keith Preston, your thoughts?
Yeah, to piggyback on what terminal philosophy was saying previously, Evola was in a unique category in that his model was something similar to the Hindu system. It was the idea of you have the very elite scholarly types and warrior caste at the top as sort of your the vanguard of your society. I think his ideal was something like India 800 BC. You know, that was his model. So yeah, he was considered an extremist or reactionary or whatever within the framework even of fascism. And it's also true that it was true that in the in the early 20th century, you had a lot of movements in Europe that were right-wing movements, but they were not conservative the way people in modern liberal democracies think of conservatism, which is basically just a defense of bourgeois society against the left. That's what, more or less what conservatism means, certainly in an American context. And they weren't thrown and altar monarchist movements either. They were something else. And you had a lot of these. You had what in Germany was called the Conservative Revolution, which was a revolutionary right that was a rival to the Nazi movement. It wasn't quite as extreme. I actually have an essay that's coming out about it soon. It's going to be in one of Troy Southgate's compilations. I also published a book a few years ago called Thinkers Against Modernity, where I review some of the thinkers that influenced the development of the conservative revolution, as well as other early to mid 20th century European thinkers that had similar views. And Evola is one. There's a discussion of Evola in the book. As far as what fascism and National Socialism would have been if they had survived longer, it is true that fascism, Italian fascism, went through multiple stages, and the final stage of that was this thing called the Italian Social Republic, which was closer to conventional socialism than what fascism had been in its earlier phase. In its earlier phase, it was more like Franco in many ways. It was this kind of just authoritarian right-wing traditionalism with some, plus some additional oddities. In its last phase, it was this thing called this Italian Social Republic, which if I had to compare it to something else, it would probably be more like Baathism or maybe Gaddafi's system, which is, it wasn't it wasn't the right, but it wasn't the left either. It was this kind of, I guess a third position, where there's an element of socialism, but it's still submerged in some kind of nationalist, whatever type of framework. And that's what the final Italian fascism in its latter years was that. And also, I think that if National Socialism, German National Socialism, Nazism had survived, it would have been what Maoism and Pol Pot and that kind of stuff was. I mean, I think that the genocide program would have been expanded. They were planning on liquidating the leadership of the churches, for example. That was one thing. And I think that they would have expanded the genocide program to include more and more groups. They even had, towards the end of the war, they actually had a conference, Nazi, whatever, I guess you could call them pseudoscientists or whatever, had a conference on ugly people where they were determining, what kind of body types and facial structures and stuff were so ugly as to be unworthy of life. It's kind of like that. There's an old episode of the Twilight Zone called The Eye of the Beholder that depicts this kind of dysfunctional society, that dystopia that deifies physical beauty in this way. And I think if the Third Reich were still here today, it would probably be about like North Korea or somewhere like that kind of a system. So I do think that was a much different kind of system qualitatively than conventional fascism or right-wing authoritarianism or the revolutionary right in the interwar period. It's really just sort of in a category by itself in terms of extremism.
Yeah, terminal philosophy.
Yeah, just to respond to something that Swithun had said earlier, which was that it's possible that fascism shares economic structural similarities to socialism. I just wanted to share one more quick Paul Gottfried quote that I think kind of puts that all together. He says, although fascists occasionally collaborated with landowners and vestiges of the aristocracy, they pinned their hopes chiefly on other social programs. They were a revolutionary right as opposed to the defenders of an ordered society, and what this right wished to impose as their vision of order was, for the most part, improvised. So, again, one other thing I wanted to say too is that when you discuss fascism in any setting or with any people, I think it also comes up quickly that you're comparing it to other things like communism, capitalism, and socialism. And I think it's important to distinguish that fascism was more authoritarian in nature, whereas Stalinist communism was probably more totalitarian in nature. And totalitarianism, almost every aspect of the individual's life is more or less dictated from the top down, whereas authoritarianism, I guess you could define it as it's not as totalitarian, but it's heavily implied and imposed that you're a small node in a much greater homogenous system. So I just think that should be established with fascism in general. And I think we're basically on closing remarks now, and so I'll just say that it's interesting. I think the timing of this conversation is good because there's folks like Keith Woods who are talking about third positionism, as well as a lot of folks on BreadTube are trying to distance themselves. A lot of folks on BreadTube will call themselves like democratic socialists or some variety like that or another. And so it's kind of in the spotlight again. And I think with this rise in nationalism in both, well, I guess you could just say Western Europe in general, with Salvini and Brexit and you name it, Hungary. I think what we're trying to figure out in this era is that we're trying to get nationalism right, but and like, sorry, let me rephrase that. I think we're trying to carefully parse out this balance between international politics and regional and nationalistic politics. And I can't remember who said this, but Todd, you mentioned this in private conversation, that World War II could also be seen as a conflict that was the fight over the true definition of socialism. And I think nowadays, with this right-wing reaction and nationalist sort of uprising, if you want to call it that, in Europe, politically speaking, it's a reaction to other things like the migrant crisis. And so I think you'll see interest in fascism, or where it's kind of being rebranded now on the folks in the Radix Journal as kind of just a third positionist type of a thing, where that interest will continue to grow, because as the neoliberal political superstructure continues to just print money, and these weird political figures are making laws, these EU types are making laws in Brussels for people who live in Eastern Europe. Well, I just don't see that as working, and yeah, it'll just be interesting to see how things progress.
Yeah, well, we are about out of time, so I'd like to thank everyone, Keith, Swithun, and Terminal, for contributing. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.